who is calling in from Houston, Texas. Brian, what's going on?
Houston, Texas, baby.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. So I'm an agnostic, but I've been having kind of an ongoing discussion with a brilliant Christian friend of mine. And he shared with me an argument related to whether or not a belief in God is warranted. And so basically the idea is that whether or not a belief in God is warranted is going to depend on whether or not God actually exists. So like if man has been created by God in the image of God, then it seems probable that the human cognitive powers that produce a belief in God are working properly when they do produce a belief in God. And so my question is, do you agree with that? Or do you think that whether or not a belief in God is warranted is independent of whether or not God actually exists?
Yeah, so I've heard a version of this before. I don't know if I've heard it quite described in that way, but there's kind of these kind of definitional arguments really where it's like, well, if God was real, then by definition, the way that your brain works, you would be, if you have the capacity to have a belief in him, then he is real. I call them definitional arguments because to me, they only work in certain ways if you take certain definitions of things to be true. So like a version of this, and this is kind of not quite the same, but Alvin Plantinga has this argument about how we can't possibly be rational under like evolution because evolution doesn't, design
towards truth.
Yeah, lean towards truth, right? Doesn't necessarily lead us to be more rational. So there's no reason for us to trust our senses, right? But it's like, well, that's not, if you take evolution under that definition, saying that it can't happen, maybe, but like just because it's not likely doesn't mean that it's not possible either. And so I kind of see a version of this here where it's like, well, yes, there might be a possibility that this is true. Like this is a possible world that exists, you might be able to say, but like that you still have to, there's still other ways that we can confirm whether that's true or not. And especially when we're talking about God belief, like what does God even mean in this specific argument? Presumably your Christian friend is talking about Yahweh, but you can use multiple different constructs of God, and it doesn't even have to be a single God. It could be multiple gods. Like this kind of argument leads itself to be open to a couple of different flaws from my take.
Well, so I'm not sure if I'm not sure if this is what you're saying, but if you take issue with this argument because it doesn't lead you to a specific God, I'm not sure if I have a problem with that necessarily because I think.
Well, let me clarify real quick, Brian, because
okay.
It doesn't even have to be an identifiable God. It just has to be a God construct that I can understand. You see what I mean? Because people use different definitions of God. I'm not even talking about religious definitions of God. I'm talking about even non-religious definitions of God. You know what I mean? Like God can be defined in so many different ways here. It's almost meaningless in that sense, right?
Okay. So, I mean, kind of in this example, I think it was used in the context of like a designer God or a creator God. And I wanted to mention the point you made with the other call about like people who say, the trees and nature and things like that, to me, that's evidence God exists. I agree. I don't really find that reasonable, but like, I'm not sure how I could really argue against that. If God existed, maybe like a kind of an intuition, maybe not like, pointing to examples in nature, but maybe like a proclivity towards theism would be likely. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so as soon as I stopped talking, I immediately anticipated you going for the creator God route, right? Because that's what a lot of people who kind of use these arguments go for. They'll say, no. We don't even mean a specific God. We just mean like a creator. But even then, that's still vague enough. It's from my understanding anyway, to almost be meaningless in some sense. Like at best, what we see is creation, maybe. But again, that doesn't identify anything about how that got here. We don't understand the processes. We don't know if it's a being or multiple beings or anything. all we see is the stuff around us, and I can see that we have stuff around us, but whether or not the stuff around us came through a completely natural processes or through some sort of supernatural intervention, like on the face of it, that argument doesn't provide any evidence one way or the other. It just says that there's a possibility, or it looks like that it could have been that way, and something looking like it could be that way doesn't necessarily, make that true. Am I being clear, Brian?
Yeah, I think so. I guess like at best, this argument would just show that like you don't have a successful art, or that like an atheist couldn't argue against it or against like nature being evidence for God per se, but that doesn't necessarily entail that nature is evidence for God. What do you think about arguments like you said? This doesn't tell you anything about what God is like. What do you think about arguments like, arguments from a necessary being, which kind of aim to show that whatever the source or whatever like the ultimate foundation of reality is, has to be an agent, because in order to explain like why specific contingent things exist rather than other possible contingent things, there would have to be some kind of like decision made or some kind of agent. Are you familiar with any of those?
Yeah, I've seen those too. I think kind of to maybe elucidate what I was trying to say earlier is if someone were saying, oh, the reason why you're feeling this way is because of your bad energies or your bad chakras. Okay. Like you can posit that as a possible explanation, but I don't know what energies are. I don't know what chakras are. I don't know how to define that. So we're talking about the possible effects of something that we don't know the mechanics of. And so I can't demonstrate that this is proof of that thing existing if we haven't defined what the mechanics of that thing is, right? And so like if we're talking about a creator with intent, right? Okay, yeah, in retrospect, I think maybe we could make that argument for certain things, but that's it's kind of a just so argument, like I could win $1 million tomorrow and I could say, well, it seems like there's a creator doing this for me. There seems like there's intent for this because I had ideas about what I would do for something and this plan is kind of coming together. But that's all it looks like. It's just, it seems like something is, but until we can even identify that planner again, or even identify the plan, it's always going to be a just so argument. It's always going to be an argument made after the fact. It doesn't have any predictive power, right?
Sure.
I think one thing I think about too a lot is if it's so unbelievable that we could just happen just because, why is that less believable than an eternal being with no beginning deciding to make us? Why is that then the more reasonable answer? Because that's the way people work. Like, people aren't the only people on the planet. Like, we're not the only living things on the planet. So why would it be that it has to be a human a human-like being like us, instead of it just being the like miraculous Big Bang or some like whatever did happen? Like, why? Yeah. Like, why is that so
Are you referring to
obscure?
Like,
it's just because
like,
that's not what we can.
And Brian was making the point too that a lot of apologists who use these arguments, they won't put any qualities to God outside of him being a creator, or maybe some other things here and there, because they're trying to make it. There's a minimalist God that they're trying to argue for. They have to strip away all these other things because you're right, you can't demonstrate any of those other qualities. But they think that there are some qualities you still can demonstrate. And my argument would be, even if you could demonstrate it, it's pretty weak, but I don't even think you get that far most of the time. Like I said, I think it's a kind of a lot of just so assumptions that you can make after facts are revealed. But yeah, Brian, you had something else you want to say?
No, I think that kind of answers my question. I mean, it seems to me that I agree with you. Like, it's just kind of after the fact rationalization, and it doesn't really add any kind of explanatory power. Or provide any kind of evidence for thinking a God exists. So.
Yeah, it's post hoc, right? Like any of these kinds of arguments that you see about authors and intent, I could easily just say, yeah, the best explanation is aliens. Well, actually, they might say, well, it has to be a being outside of time and stuff, and like that's all nonsense too. That's a whole other thing. You'd have to dive into some physics and stuff on why that doesn't necessarily make sense. But
yes,
point
it
is,
just sounds like man-made science fiction.
Yeah, like
the whole Earth isn't revolved around the way that we perceive science fiction.
The way I see it, Brian, is if Christians had evidence of God for real, they wouldn't be making these kinds of arguments. The arguments we would be seeing would be much different. And I think that's something to think about as well. But yeah, good luck with trying to talk to your friend about some of this stuff. I know it gets kind of complicated really fast. And thanks again for calling in for the show. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for calling.
Yeah, so like I'd like to say I'm pretty good about talking about these kinds of arguments and stuff.
I think you're good.
Well, thank you. Well, the reason I'm saying it, right, is because I'm not really a debate person. I guess I'm not known for doing debates, but there's still ways you can kind of explain this stuff, or at least explain your point of view, I think, without necessarily getting into fights with people. As long as you're super clear about your definition. So like even there, I noticed that Brian was trying to argue or bring the point about just the regular creator God. And I noticed you chimed in about, well, how can God have these human qualities and stuff, right? And like, that's a trap. That's a trap that a lot of apologists use. They want you to say that. They want you to go the extra mile so they can say, no, we're not even going that far. We're trying to make a smaller case. So it's something you got to look out for, and just being very, very careful with your terms when you talk about this stuff. So let's go ahead and